Okay, here we go. Stand by. 3, 2, 1.
The Thinking Atheist. It's not a person. It's a symbol. An idea.
The population of atheists in this country is going through the roof.
Rejecting faith. Pursuing knowledge. Challenging the sacred.
If I tell the truth, it's because I tell the truth. Not because I put my hand on a book and made a wish.
And working together for a more rational world.
Take the risk of thinking for yourself. Much more happiness, truth, beauty, and wisdom will come to you that way.
Assume nothing. Question everything. And start thinking. This is the Thinking Atheist podcast. Hosted by Seth Andrews.
This is a rebroadcast with permission of a recent appearance I did on the Atheist and Christian Book Club. Normally they have these book clubs in person in the Dallas area. They bring an author in and there's a live audience. And so the author talks about the book and then fields questions from the audience. But they're doing these online, of course, because of COVID. And they asked if I would be the November author. And I said, sure. And they're like, are you okay with fielding questions from a lot of Christians? Like, we had a few atheists who were throwing out some things, but most of what I got came from religious people. And we had a direct but civil and pleasant exchange. And I thought it might be interesting for you. If you want to watch the Zoom video version of this, that is linked in the description box. Starts with some announcements about the organization, what they do, how they do it. They asked me for a setup, my background, a synopsis of the book, and then the Q&A actually kicks in around the 20-minute mark or so. Anyway, maybe this discussion will help you in your own discussions. I hope you enjoy.
Welcome to the Atheist and Christian Book Club, a monthly gathering of believers and skeptics who discuss important books and topics from both an atheist and a Christian perspective. The Atheist and Christian Book Club is facilitated by Watchman Fellowship Incorporated. You can find out more about the ministry of Watchman Fellowship at watchman.org. That's watchman.org. You can also find out more about the book club at atheistchristianbookclub.com. That's atheistchristianbookclub.com. This is a video presentation of our November 2020 club meeting where we civilly discussed not only Christianity and atheism, but politics as well. Seth Andrews joined us live on Zoom for our November meeting to discuss his latest book, Confessions of a Former Fox News Christian. Seth is a former Christian, now an atheist, and graciously agreed to participate in dialogue with both atheists and believers about his book and his thoughts on the media, faith, and politics. Our nation is in the midst of one of the most important presidential elections of our time, with passionate conviction held by each side. We hope that our book club meeting will encourage you, no matter your political persuasion, to remember the necessity of goodwill and civility in discussing such important matters with those with whom you disagree. As the Apostle Paul exhorts us in Romans 12:18, quote, "If possible, so far as it depends on you, be at peace with all men," end quote.
Welcome to the Atheist and Christian Book Club. My name is James Walker. I'm a Christian apologist, president of Watchman Fellowship, focused on interfaith evangelism. Also with us is our co-founder, Bill Cluck, who's a former Christian, now atheist. And what the club is, we're a monthly gathering of both believers and skeptics, respectfully discussing important books from both perspectives. So typically we'll take an atheist book one month and then a Christian book the next month. And we try to get into substantive dialogue and kind of get out of our own echo chambers for at least one night of the month and hear ideas that we don't agree with, we probably don't agree with, but to interact with them, to hopefully ask some good questions ourselves, but also listen to questions and to be able to interact with people that we don't necessarily agree with. In the course of the 3.5 years we've been doing it, we've developed some close relationships, some friendships, and so what we like to say is we're not just friendly, we are friends at this point. So what we're going to ask, I know we're going to have a lot of new people because we're not doing it in person. This is our second month because of the pandemic of going through Zoom and doing a digital book club. So we know that we're not just limited to the Dallas-Fort Worth area, that we have people. Well, last month we had people all over the United States and as far away as India and Africa. So what we want to do is especially if you're new to the club, we do want you to be able to ask questions of our author today. Hard-hitting, tough questions are welcome, but we do want to be respectful. We don't want to be personal attacks. We don't want to belittle or make a caricature. We tend to want to hopefully make a steel man argument instead of a straw man argument. In other words, try to listen to what they're saying and see if we can say it back at least that good, and then to ask our questions. So we're going to have an opportunity to get to those questions later. I'm going to also formally introduce our co-founder, Bill Cluck, in just a minute. But before we do that, I want to talk to you about some things we have upcoming that I'm real excited about. First of all, on our website, which is atheistchristianbookclub.com, we have posted last month's Zoom meeting. So you can go there if you didn't get a chance and watch. We had Dr. Gary Habermas, friend of mine, who's one of the leading Christian experts on the resurrection. But last month he talked with us. He had a talk and then a dialogue, Q&A on near-death experiences. And I want to encourage you to go back if you didn't get a chance to watch that live and to watch it at atheistchristianbookclub.com. And then next month, we're going to have Frank Turek as our guest author. He's the co-author of the book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, co-authored with Norman Geisler. And this was actually supposed to be back in March. He was supposed to be with us live right here in Arlington. But with the pandemic, we had to postpone it. And with the pandemic stretching on, we thought, hey, we better go ahead and do this by Zoom. And we can always do something live later. So you want to, again, make your reservations for that and get the book. We're focusing, Brady, remind me, which chapter are we mainly focused on?
We're going to focus on chapter number 12. If you're on Audible, it's actually chapter 13, and the title of the chapter is, Did Jesus Really Rise from the Dead?
Yeah, it's a pretty substantial book, so, the whole book's going to be fair game. Feel free to ask questions or talk about that with Frank here, but our main focus chapter is going to be that one, and then we have another one. Now, the date of this is tentative, but we're really excited about that. Our that's December 3rd for Frank Turek, and then on January, for our January book club, what's that, January 7th, Tuesday, January 7th, we're going to have a favorite here at the book club. He's been with us in person before, Tim McGrew, and Tim McGrew is going to be joined by Graham Opie, and we're going to be looking at one of their books. Graham Opie is an Australian philosopher, former Christian, now atheist. He is deconverted from Christianity to atheism as a teen. He's written numerous books, including the Blackwell Companions to Philosophy series, a companion to atheism and philosophy. A number of other books as well. He's going to be representing the atheist view of Christian philosophy. And then Tim McGrew wrote the section on the Christian perspective, and he's going to be joining us as well. The book is the Four Views book, I think by Zondervan. Yes. Christianity and Philosophy, the Four Views on. And we're going to be focused mainly on those two sections, Graham Oppie's and also Tim McGrew. And I want to encourage you to go ahead and take a look at that. We're real excited about that one. Both the guys have said they want to do it. It's a little bit iffy on the date, so we're going to put a tentative on that, but we're leaning toward being able to do that for our January book club on January 7th. And so our guest today, I'll introduce in just a moment. First of all, I did want to see if we could have a word from our other co-founder, Bill Cluck, former Christian, now atheist. Bill, welcome back to the club.
I was at the Metroplex Atheist here in town, and someone said, you need to listen to the Thinking Atheist. And I went, I'll give it a try. So I've been a fan for about 5 years. It's just great people on it, just really nice subjects, really thoughtful, and a big fan, Seth.
No, you're very kind. Thank you.
Well, and that is our guest. To introduce our guest to us, Seth Andrews is our guest author. In 2004, Seth was a committed conservative, I guess you would say Fox News Christian, very conservative. But he watched a video debate between Christopher Hitchens and Rabbi Botich, which made him decide to leave the faith. In 2008, he told his family and friends that he was an atheist and launched an online community and weekly podcast called The Thinking Atheist. He's author of numerous books, and I hope, Seth, this goes well and we're able to come back and do some of your other books in the future. But one of his books, Deconverted, he wrote the book Sacred Cow. But his brand new book we're going to be talking about tonight, I'm very excited about, is his 2020 book, Confessions of a Former Fox News Christian. Seth Andrews, welcome to the Atheist and Christian Book Club.
It's an honor to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Well, listen, I wanted to know if you could do us a favor and just take about maybe 10, 12 minutes, something like that. And some of the people that are joining tonight just found out about the club. They haven't had a chance to read the book. Some of them, we did a video alternative. If you didn't have time to finish the book, we promoted the Shannon Q interview on the book. But there are some that really don't know anything about the book. So you just take a few minutes and the thesis of the book, what you were trying to accomplish, and a little bit of background on that.
Sure. Well, that begins with the background on me. The Thinking Atheist is not a person. It's certainly not me. It is an idea. It's a symbol that encourages the rejection of faith and the embrace of reason when it comes to determining what is true, because I came out of a faith culture. I was raised by fundamentalist Christian parents in the Bible Belt. I sort of got a cafeteria of all the major Protestant religions. You know, Dad was ex-Lutheran, went to a Baptist school. Mom was Pentecostal, believed in speaking in tongues, and we went to various churches, So we always believed a literal Bible, but the styles of our services or our churches were always a little bit varied here and there. And ultimately, I was a student leader, communicator, ended up a Christian broadcaster. I was a Christian radio host for 12 years. At a station in Tulsa, Oklahoma. For most of that, KXOJ 100.9, we played Amy Grant, Stephen Curtis Chapman, Michael W. Smith, etc. And after that, then I segued out of radio into video production. I did fundraising videos, mostly for churches. The company I worked for had like an 80% church clientele. So I traveled the country, and I produced ministry and promotional and fundraising videos for churches far and wide. And the debate video that James mentioned was sort of a fork in the road for me, but my doubts had started back in the 90s. And it was, I think, right at the point when I saw the debate video by Hitch that I began to give myself permission to go down the rabbit hole I was afraid, but I was scared. Well, what happens, if the dominoes start to fall? But it was actually a long process for me. Took, over a year of real digging and reading and watching and learning and trying to figure it all out and navigating my own thing before I was even able to say the word atheist out loud. And that was a tough journey. That was a wild ride, but at one point in my life, I was that sort of flag waving God and country. The founding fathers were all Christian. We belong to Christianity. The America is the world kind of an evangelical conservative. We see a lot of those types of people, certainly today. And, I was glued to Fox News. Fox News' primetime lineup then, as it is now, was just stacked with conservative activists, conservative evangelical firebrands, promoting a specific faith, which is Christianity. That was my rallying cry, man. I was all over that. I listened to Rush Limbaugh, Glenn Beck, Michael Savage, and I was in this sort of cocoon where the Fox News culture fed into me this narrative that we are one nation under God. And by the way, the nation's always under attack by the other, and the other could be anything. Certainly the Democrats, the seculars, the atheists, the gays, the immigrant, the Muslim, just pick one. I mean, we were always looking out for the other. America it's a war on Jesus. And we see that, we've seen that, of course, with the war on Christmas narrative. Every December, every November, we see it. They play it like clockwork. Christmas is under attack. They want to make Christmas illegal. And here I am now, an atheist activist. I love Christmas. I call it Christmas. We celebrate Christmas. We don't celebrate a literal birth of a baby Jesus or anything like that. But Christmas can be meaningful beyond that, And if you want to celebrate it religiously, great. If you don't, great. The holiday is what you make it. I can celebrate it in my own way. I'm not taking anything away from somebody else. But when I was a Fox News Christian, I was convinced that, it does take something away from me. And it is going to diminish us at our moral core. And it's going to allow the gateway to open where the devil can come and infiltrate and infect our children. And God will further remove his hand of blessing. And it was this sort of superiority complex that I had. And I had a lot of fear of the other. I didn't understand people. I hadn't really gotten into how other people are and what they're like. I just othered them. And, there's a reason that Fox News hits a primary demographic of white evangelicals. That is their core audience, and they skew a little more male, right-wing radio even more so. They are a bubble. They're a cocoon that teaches you, that trains you to distrust everybody else. Fox News calls itself fair and balanced. The implication is that everybody else is unfair and unbalanced. So it draws you into their embrace. And I was curious as to sort of how I got to those conclusions and what that culture was like for me. And now I'm on the other side of the looking glass, looking back at my former self. How much of my evangelical ideas had impacted my philosophies about the world? Well, it was everything. It affected everything I did. And so once I left the faith, I had to go back and sort of reverse engineer it. Well, wait a minute. How do I really feel about right to die issues? How do I feel about the legalization of recreational drugs? How do I feel about immigration or the death penalty or the right of a woman to choose what happens to a fetus? Reproductive choice. Like, is it really my business, the government's business, the church's business, or is that really an onus on the woman herself? And, I had to go back just point by point, and I just realized that I was coming out of a culture that had been only a reinforcement culture, often a fear culture, and it was a very tribal culture. And I wanted to examine where Fox came from, why and how it is essentially an extension of a Republican White House. It's been called Dear Leader State-Run Television for a reason. Donald Trump frequently watches Fox News. And you'll hear him echo Lou Dobbs and Tucker Carlson and Sean Hannity, and he's that's his favorite place to go and have an interview. It's almost always friendly ground. There's a reason for that. And I know bias exists throughout the media. You'll find right-leaning, you'll find left-leaning, you'll find those who are actually more fair and actually balanced and approach the facts more evenly. But Fox is something interesting. It's something unique. It's something that the United States hadn't really seen anything like before it founded in 1996. So the book goes through that. And it also goes through, I think, major, socio-political, even moral issues related to the Fox News culture. We get into the gun culture, and I'm a gun owner. But, I go into heavy criticisms of the National Rifle Association. We get into the quote-unquote gay agenda. We were taught to be afraid of the gay. How my own best friend had come out to me as gay in the 90s and almost cost us our relationship, and how we got through that, salvaged a friendship. We talk about this idea that America is number one simply because we say it's number one, but we can't demonstrate it really in any meaningful metric. We're the greatest country. In what metric are we the greatest? Well, I examine it, cost of living and the quality of health care and lifespan and the size of our military and, the overall peace index. How warlike are we? How miserable are people? Poverty, those types of things. We're not doing all that great. We have a lot of work to do. And then at the end of the book, I take to task many of my fellow lefties, especially the more extreme ones, who, have just gone off the rails. The idea that my fellow liberals and I are immune to bad ideas. That's just crazy. We're human beings. We can be tribal and we can be wrong. And, I thought, well, if I'm going to genuinely come in here and tackle the Fox News culture, I need to take at least a chapter and talk about my fellow libs and say, hey, some of you guys have just left the reservation and you're doing real damage. And, it's just some of this stuff's just crazy. It's too much. And we need to sort of draw ourselves back and refocus on the issues at hand. I think the book is written in good faith. It's written with goodwill. I think it's well defended. It's certainly flawed like the author, but it's something I'm really proud of. And if you want to find out more, I'm actually signing copies, SethAndrews.com. You can just go and there's a little button to do that. So that's me and the book in a nutshell. How did I do? 12 minutes? I just vamped it. I wasn't even keeping track.
So, yeah, it was a good synopsis. For those that didn't get to read it, I think you did a great job of not only talking about your main points, but also some of your motives behind it and things like that. I wanted to get a question in pretty quickly from our co-founder, Bill Cluck. But before that, I did have just an observation for you. One of the things that, in my experience with the book club, and even before that, I was a regular attendee at the Metroplex Atheist. At least once a month for over a year, I would sit down and share time with the kind of a fellowship of atheists that were meeting there. They were very welcoming, and learned a lot. And one of the things that I learned is that maybe I had stereotyped too much about what I thought an atheist is going to believe on things. If you're atheist, you're going to believe X, Y, and Z. And I was surprised to find members of the NRA there that conservative on a lot of different issues, and in our book club as well as in Metroplex Atheist, a lot of atheists who are pro-life, a great example, about 2 years ago, I interviewed Robert Price. You probably know.
Yeah, I know Bob.
He wrote a book called Beyond Born Again that we were reviewing in the book club. He's a former Christian, now atheist, Jesus mythicist, actually. Doesn't believe that Jesus ever existed. But for decades, Robert Price was a fellow of the Jesus Seminar. And so what he did, he would get with these other New Testament scholars, PhDs, and they would vote, a very liberal group, but vote on, did Jesus say anything in the New Testament? They used beads and vote on what was said. And but I was surprised when I interviewed to find that he'd resigned from the Jesus Seminar. And I asked why, and he said, well, I'm a major Donald Trump supporter. And he said, I just got so tired of the bigotry and the bashing and the intolerance that I was experiencing from the other scholars there because of my stance on that. I just couldn't take it anymore. I resigned. And so that kind of surprised me because, again, I still want to think probably atheists are going to be in this direction and Christians are going to be in that direction. But even, at our Christians that are part of our book club, there's quite a diversity. And what I'm learning is there's a diversity in the atheist community as well. So do you think that maybe there was a little bit of painting with a broad brush or just characterizing all Christians are going to be this way politically and all atheists are going to be that way politically? Do you think that came across in your book at all?
No, I think in the last chapter I spoke directly to those conservatives. You may be frustrated at this moment because perhaps you are a fiscal conservative, so you're voting in terms of taxation or the role or size of government. Those people exist. I think the reason that passions are so high in regard to Donald Trump is because we believe, those of us who are in opposition to him are convinced that we are seeing something that no one has ever seen in the presidency so far. This is not a political divide. We believe that he is a malignant narcissist and sociopath who is using the White House for moment by moment cruelty. He is the antithesis of the best teachings of Jesus Christ. He is the antithesis of what we would ever teach our children to be, to bully, to lie, to use people, to the predation of women, those types of things. And so as an atheist, that says one thing about me. I don't believe in a God, okay? But as a humanist, what am I about? And I'm about acceptance. I'm about kindness. I'm about fairness and truth and reason. And I don't see any of those attributes in the commander-in-chief. And so those conversations are often, I think, very passionate because we see people like I like Bob, but I don't get how a humanist can look at someone who displays moment by moment anti-humanist tendencies. The assault on decency, his Twitter feed alone is evidence of that. I think, how do you rally behind that? And there are so many mechanisms, I think, in play for his support. I think we leave some of that to the sociologists, but I think there are people who are simply fiscal conservatives and all else. Maybe they are anti-choice or they are anti-abortion. So that's sort of their defining thing, and they're willing to excuse everything else. You might be able to rationalize like Franklin Graham has and say, well, God sometimes uses flawed people, kind of the King Cyrus argument. I don't buy that for 1 second. But, I lament that he's been treated poorly. I think that is the result of the fact that we are human and flawed and passions are high. But if I was to sit across from Bob at coffee, and I'd love to do that, I would have to stand directly opposed to his support of someone I believe is doing tremendous damage. And I would have to do that because I care about people. And so I lament that, he feels that way, but I understand the frustrations whenever he expresses his support for Donald Trump.
Yeah. So, tolerance has to be a two-way street. So it's easier to be tolerant with people that agree with me, though. That's what.
I think that's a different conversation, James. I think, people get respect. Ideas have to earn it. I don't have to be tolerant of a terrible idea. I don't have to be tolerant of bigotry or somebody sticking their nose into somebody else's bedroom or throwing some sort of an edict at them and saying you have to live this way or do this way or else, judgment, hell, whatever. Or, you are threatened to be ostracized by someone else, or maybe you're just an awful person. I think people, we should do our best to try to respect the people, but the ideas, those are fair game. And I don't have to be tolerant of terrible ideas. I think those ideas need to be defeated in the arena of ideas. Robert Ingersoll once famously said, the more false we destroy, the more room we make for the true. I think that's just a great way to look at it. Let's go out and destroy the false, respecting people wherever we can. But, when we're speaking to our values, that's pretty important and critical stuff.
Hey, Bill. Bill is our co-founder of the Atheist Christian Book Club, and I know that you were able to read the book. Did you have any insights, questions from an atheist perspective? What was your takeaway, Bill?
Oh, I thoroughly enjoyed the book, and let me say, the Thinking Atheist is very fair and balanced.
Trademark. Right there on the top right corner. Thank you very much.
No, I saw you interview this Methodist minister, and she was going, that Paul, he's off the rails. And, I don't know. You were talking about when you raped somebody, a guy had to marry her. And she was saying, that's a good thing because now she's off the street. And you were going, your apologetics is nuts. It's like, I like you, but so you were bending over to be fair and balanced with her. And it's just, you got to remember, Methodist, anything goes there. So,
what's that about?
Yeah.
Well, people are surprised to learn that I married a Christian. So people are like, well, Seth hates Christians. I'm like, I married one. I share life with one. She's the most beautiful person I know. And so, I try not to put people in boxes. And I do on my show, I try to take great pains to speak about believers in 3 dimensions, because there is this tendency by all of us to speak about others in labels. You throw out the jab and the one-liner and bam, bam, bam. And atheists do have some bad arguments that I'm seeing less of. But, religion is a mental illness. And I'm like, that's just crazy. That makes no sense. And it's a terrible argument, and you should stop saying it, because there are tremendously intelligent people who are God believers. They're tremendously kind and good and charitable people. My next door neighbor is a worship pastor at one of the biggest churches in town. And he's an amazing human being. I would trust him with my house, with my car, I think the guy is absolutely of tremendous moral fiber. And so he doesn't fit in a box. He's good people. So I'm glad to hear that you feel that the show is fair, because I really do strive for that.
Oh, absolutely. And one thing, you were kind of preaching my gospel. I'm a big believer in we are not aware of how culture affects us. We have, like, right here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, we have 7 seminaries. We have Christian television. We have Christian publishing houses. We have all this bias hitting us from all sides. And with you particular, your parents wrote a Greek New Testament guide. They were married in the Holy Land. And we don't realize we're swimming in this Christian culture, but we don't realize it because we're in the culture. So it's very difficult for us to objectively see it. So my question to you, Seth, is there any way you weren't going to be a Christian with all that bias? Because your bias was like off the rails.
Well, you speak to the what I think are the 2 major determining factors for belief: family and geography, right? Mm-hmm. Where were you born?
Yeah.
What's the religion of your parents? Like, if I'd been born in Yemen, right, am I going to be a conservative Baptist / I was never a Pentecostal. I was always a Baptist, really, because I'm more conservative in nature. So I leaned more into the Baptist church and Baptist school. But if I'm born in Yemen, I'm going to be Muslim. If I'm born in Mexico, my money's on Catholicism. If I'm one of the Eastern religions, well, that you can probably pinpoint part of the world I might have come from. And I find that it's a really interesting thing because, you're growing up. This is why churches like to target young children. I don't think they do it maliciously, but they call it the 4 to 14 window. Because if you find somebody who is 25 years old and for the first time you tell them that there was a deity that created the universe and there was a dirt man and a rib woman in a garden with talking animals, and all of those penguins walked or waddled 8,000 miles to board a boat in the desert to, if you put all those stories together and shoot it to them when they are into the age of reason, they just raise an eyebrow and I'll see you later. But if you do it to a trusting 4-year-old, you're the same person that taught them look both ways before you cross the street. Don't talk to strangers. I'm going to help you do the homework to learn about the world. They have to give you absolute trust. And in that trust, you then give them the truth of a specific Jesus story. You are much more inclined to sort of have that replicated in your own mind. And, I found that's an interesting study because if you talk to somebody who believes in a specific faith, God, holy book, denomination, whatever, go a little deeper under the skin. Hey, where were you born? And what was the religion of your parents? Those are the first 2 questions I like to ask. And I'm probably 85% of the time. It's just like clockwork, that's, I was front loaded, I'm going to be a Christian child. I'm going to grow up and be a Christian adult. It took me decades to crawl out. Of course, now that I'm out, my family's horrified.
I really enjoyed listening. But you're talking about John Loftus' outsider test of faith, the 2 things that determine what you believe. And it's funny, you have people like John Loftus who got converted early, Bart Ehrman, the guy that's the head of the Skeptic Society. People, these are very smart people. Michael Shermer. I mean, you couldn't imagine anybody more skeptical. He got sucked in just like I did at 17 or whatever. So you can be smart, but you're not smart enough to escape bias and confirmation bias. Am I right?
Well, yeah. Sometimes we can outsmart ourselves. I think you will find many of the really, really, really intelligent people are often they're some of the best people at sort of putting together the arguments, connecting the dots in a way that shows, intelligent design and that kind of thing. So, I mean, we can all outsmart ourselves. And I think, atheists can be guilty and believers can be guilty. There's also, I think, most believers know very little about their own belief or religion. At least here in the United States, this is such a problem that apologists and pastors are writing books about it. How do we deal with this Bible illiteracy problem that we have? And what I think is that it's not really about the basics of the Bible. People are not going to church because they really care a whole lot about Adam and Eve. They don't care about Noah's Ark. They don't care about the giants and Samson and his hair and, all that
Absolutely.
stuff. they're not going because they want to be told they're unworthy and going to hell. Most of the churches we see now, the major churches, are actually shifting their theology to be less Calvinistic, and it's more about kind of a Tony Robbins thing. You are somebody. You can be somebody. Go be happy. Jesus loves you, Rah, rah, go team. But they're going not because it's a theological exercise, but because it's family. I mean, we're tribal. Right. You go, you're greeted. There are ministries that train people to greet you. There's hot coffee. There's a place for your kids. You enjoy communal music. You hear an inspirational message when something goes wrong. You got people who are there to take care of your needs and to love you and take care of you. I mean, man, I understand the appeal of religious communities. And I think that's one of the things that makes it so hard, because I think once you get to a point where the theology starts to fall apart, I don't think this makes sense. Historically, scientifically, morally, this is not working. This doesn't jive. You're also immediately in conflict because, what? If this is not true, will I lose my church, my family, my community, the support system that I have? What are the other implications? And boy, that makes it real easy to sort of keep you from tapping on the glass and asking too many hard questions.
Yeah, they have a lot of these hip churches here in Dallas.
Oh, you guys got Fellowship Church, don't you?
Oh, Fellowship and Gateway. And, the only unforgivable sin is not to be hip. You can be forgiven for anything, do whatever you want. It's a huge church. And that church out of Australia, the Rocking Church.
Hillsong,
Oh, my gosh, it's just come here. So it's just ridiculous. But anyway, I know Christians want to get to you. And let me ask you one quick question. Are you familiar with the evolutionary argument against naturalism? That what it says is we, being evolved, have all these problems and biases and faults. We're not evolving for objective, intelligent reasoning. We evolved to survive. So Alvin Plantinga made this argument. So how in the world can we trust our own minds, our own judgments, when it's just here a mishap or, a just lucky random chance that we got here in the first place?
Well, I'm not an evolutionary biologist, but I have a perspective. I don't think we can necessarily just trust our brain. Like there's so many examples of how our brains can be tricked. Our brain is often wired for shortcuts, which, as you mentioned, is part of our survival, right? When the brain has to come upon a decision or to deal with a perception quickly, often it will lean in a specific direction that makes us more apt to survive, but it may not be rooted in the reality. That type 2 or type 1 and type 2, the false positive and the positive, the patternicity argument, when something happens and we assume the worst for our own personal safety, etc., or when we see patterns because we have simply evolved to see patterns, we may see some when none are there, faces on the face of the moon, on the surface of the moon, and we see random events and we tie them all together as if it's some kind of a serendipitous convergence. So I think, our brains are extremely amazing machines, but they can be easily tricked by those who know how to trick them. And I think then we have to lean on the processes of science to help overcome that. It's the best, it's an imperfect tool, but it's the best tool we have to sort of navigate through our own biases and misperceptions and those types of things. So you experiment again, you check the results, you come to a conclusion, you still leave the door open because you're going to continue testing and maybe that conclusion has to be updated. I like that line that says that an open mind is meant to be closed on something. Meaning that if you come across something that is overwhelmingly demonstrated, it's okay to take an open mind. And then, if someone comes to me and says the earth is not a sphere, well, my brain's already closed on that. It's not welded shut. I'm not saying that someone could not come along and demonstrate to me somewhere that we actually exist in a snow globe or something else. I mean, I have to be willing to be able to reopen it. But I think an open mind is meant to close on some things once you have a preponderance of evidence for it. And that evidence comes through the scientific method. And I think that's the method we have to rely on.
Great. Hey, thanks. Enjoyed your book again.
So much more of this exchange still to come. On the other side of this, I address the question, for people who change their minds on important things like religion, or they shift politically from one view to another, are we talking about a change of the brain? Like if somebody's mental wiring predisposes them to lean into something, what would then cause them to lean away from it? We talk about that after this. Would you like a video greeting from me to somebody you love on their special occasion? Find me on Cameo at cameo.com. I've been sending out birthday greetings, anniversary greetings, just for the hell of it, greetings for people who might need a boost or an encouraging word. It's so much fun. It helps to support my work. If you'd like a video greet for somebody in your life, search Seth Andrews at cameo.com. And now we continue the Q&A from my November appearance with the Atheist and Christian Book Club.
I think it was chapter 2. Seth, you have a thing about a section about brain physiology and studies, tests that were done, like a conservative mind versus a more liberal mind, and the part of the mind that's in use is the reactive or the maybe the emotional center rather than an analytical part of the brain, and the implication was this is maybe why you have the Fox News Christian react the way they do, because they're not thinking analytically, they're using the emotional part of their brain and all. But my question to you is, do you feel when you deconverted from atheism to Christianity, do you think that changed your brain physiology, or do you feel like that you're still that way? You've just switched, instead of being, anti-CNN and anti-Washington Post and New York Times. Now you've just switched sides where you're using that same brain physiology, but now the target is conservative Christian nationalism and Fox News.
Well, I think that, I don't know if my brain has changed, but I think ideas can be changed. Mine was really more experiential. I had been trained to think a specific way. I had been indoctrinated, for lack of a better word, from a specific culture. And so when you come out of that culture and begin to get your bearings, it's not really as much about, I don't think it's as much about, my brain altering, but being introduced to different ideas in a world that I never knew existed before. I also like to think that I was a little bit skeptical from the front end. I'm not a great mind, but it was in the 90s that I started to sort of cross out certain specific parts of my Christian theology, specifically relating to my gay best friend, because I felt like, this is an egregious wrong to condemn this man. And even though at the time I didn't really understand, I knew that he was a beautiful guy and I wanted his friendship. I didn't want to judge him. So I'd already started to sort of deconstruct. And now I don't see it as I traded one religion for another, one bias for another. We're all guilty of bias. I see it more as I was raised in a bubble. And I finally gave myself permission to step out. And once I began to become introduced to other ideas, other people, other experiences, other information, it opened up my world. And I was able to then decide for myself how I felt. And, we should definitely be skeptical of the messages that come at us, be it CNN or whatever. But I don't believe we can make the equivalence argument. I don't think that all media is equally biased. I don't think that as far right as this, then this is automatically just as far left or blah, blah, blah. Atheism is not a religion. It's not a dogma. It's not any of the things that many people say. I haven't switched one for another. I simply left one. And then I was able to decide for myself how I felt about pretty much everything else in my life.
It's an argument I get a lot of times. I'm a former Mormon, now evangelical. And so a lot of our critique is of the Book of Mormon and things like that. But so what I get a lot of pushback from my Mormon friends is, James, you can leave Mormonism, but you can't leave us alone. So it's maybe you get the same criticism that you can leave Christianity, but you can't leave them alone. I don't know.
Well, but there is that's a salient point, or you stumble upon a salient point, or actually you directed us to a salient point, and that is that I think your background gives you a unique perspective and ability to speak to it. And because you came out of it and you feel like it might be, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you feel like it might be doing some things that are untoward or even damaging to other people, then you have the opportunity to do something about it. And you want to be a part of the solution. So it's not that you're obsessed with Mormonism and you can't leave Mormonism alone because you've got some sort of a defect. You take it personally because it was your history. And you can speak to what goes on behind the halls and behind the walls and in the rooms and in the minds and in the cultures and in the families and traditions and the dogmas and the Book of Mormon and all that stuff. You know it, and you have a unique perspective and ability to do something about it. And I think there's a satisfaction in having that. So I don't think you're obsessed or any of those types of things. I think you genuinely are trying to right something that you know is wrong, and I think that's cool.
And you do see some possible parallels there with your own. I know let's just talk about the motive for writing the book. You're wanting to help those Fox News Christians, right?
Well, it's partially. I don't spend a lot of time with people who I consider to be what's called doxastically closed. I mean, they're just a closed system. You know, you've met those types of people. I used to be one of those types of people. I don't care what you say. I'll never change my mind. You'll never change what I'm thinking. Nope, I'm not going to change. You know, I immediately just tell you right off the bat. And I'm always
we both said that, and obviously we both changed. So yeah. You never say never, right?
But I think, had to come to a moment when we decided that we were ready to take that journey. If someone had come in with a sledgehammer and tried to beat us over the head, we would have then felt attacked. I think people change their minds from a position of safety. That's why when I'm speaking one-on-one to somebody about anything, I don't do insults and ridicule and mockery in the one-on-ones. Sometimes ridiculous ideas need ridicule. You know, the earth is flat in the 21st century. I'm sorry. You know, that's just irredeemably stupid. You know, and so on the large stage, on the macro stage, I think, you know, mockery has its place. You can roast the sacred cows, but you're not going after people specifically individually. In the individual conversations, the attack has the reverse effect, right? They double down, the walls go up, they feel like they have to defend. Now they're really not listening. Before you know it, voices are raised, everybody's shouting, nothing's getting accomplished. And I find that hugely unproductive. I think, you know, we need to... And in the age of the internet, it's even harder in the Twitterverse. You know, when did we lose the ability to actually sit down and talk, and more importantly, listen to each other as human beings? You're not an avatar. You're not a two-dimensional image on my Twitter feed, but you're a flesh and blood person who has a story and you have value. When did we lose the ability to sit down and do that? And that's one of the reasons I agreed to be here, is because I think, you know, I love the idea that people who have maybe a different point of view here and there can still sit around and be good to each other. And it's, you know, that's been a real pleasure for me.
Well, thanks. And that's certainly our goal here. So I think we do have some questions. Daniel or Brady, do we know who's first one to?
We have a couple of questions. I'm going to unmute Ron. So Ron is one of our book club attendees and supporters. He's local here in the DFW area. He runs the chapter from our Reasonable Faith in Collin County. And Ron is in the book club, active with us in apologetics and Christianity in the DFW area. So Seth, meet Ron. Ron, meet Seth. And Ron, go ahead.
Seth, appreciate your reasonableness. Seriously,
I don't care what everybody else says about me. I'm an okay guy. So,
delight to be part of this meeting. I have so many questions. I don't know where to start, Daniel. Hey, you mentioned earlier that something about about kindness and acceptance and tolerance. And I wonder from your, and I'll connect that with a question I asked later in chat, and that is, if atheism is not a religion, would you call it a worldview? In other words, your explanation your personal opinion, your reasonable conclusions about where we came from, why we're here, how we ought to behave, and what happens when we die. So with that perspective, I'll let you answer that question if you'd like, and then ask why, from the atheist perspective, are kindness and acceptance and tolerance good things?
Well, atheism is not a worldview. Atheism is simply the non-belief in gods.
Okay.
I'm not convinced, right? I'm not saying with an exclamation point, there is no God. I think specific gods, we can say they have completely been disproven. The gods with a proper name, then you can go back and look at the record and you can begin to dissect that. But even the deistic God argument, I'm just saying that I personally am not convinced. So, you'll find rational atheists, you'll find irrational atheists, you'll find liberal and conservative, Democrat, Republican, libertarian, independent. You'll find nasty, angry, horrible atheists and beautiful, loving, kind atheists. I met a flat earth atheist once in Chicago. That was fun, So it's really not about, for me, about atheism or religion. Are you a good person? It comes down to really beyond that. What kind of a human being are you? Are you a good person? Because that determines if we'll hang out. If you're a nasty atheist, a human being is just toxic to people. So what? If you're an atheist, you're a terrible person. I don't want you in my life.
I appreciate that. May I ask, why is it good to be a good and nice person?
Well, I think, I was taught that goodness only came from God. And there are versions of this. The apologists talk about the objective moral standard, implying a standard bearer, blah, blah, blah. And we could get into that, I suppose. I think it makes perfect sense that we have evolved ethical systems because in the infancy of our species, we as cooperative beings, as ethical beings, were more likely to do well, right? If we were terrible to other people, if we weren't adapting communities, if we weren't tribal and creating family units and doing beneficial things to fortify those units, we're more likely not to have food. We're more likely to get killed by predators or something else. Cooperation then became really a survival mechanism. And as we evolved, I think we also evolved the pleasure mechanisms that relate to beneficial behavior. I think that explains altruism. To be able to do something good for somebody else, expecting nothing in return. Because at the end of the day, we really do get something in return. We get a good feeling for helping someone else, and this is part of an evolved ethical system. I find it a little bit terrifying to look at my former self and think that I would have to be told by a third party that being awful is awful, and that murder and theft and rape and all those things are wrong, and that I would have to have some sort of a dogma to make me a good person. I think it makes more sense for us to be good for its own sake. There's no crown, there's no jewel, there's no, mansion in heaven to expect. There's no favor from God I have to try to work toward. I'm doing good because I genuinely want to help my community, my humanity, and all of that then in turn comes back and helps me as well.
I just watched the first season of The Man in the High Castle, and those thoughts are going through my head as you talk about how we've evolved and how we've done better by being good, quote unquote, and nice to each other.
I haven't seen The Man in the High Castle. I don't have a point of reference. Forgive me.
Without going into it, the premise in the first episode, which is worth watching, it's on Amazon Prime if you're interested. The premise is that you're in a world where Germany got the atomic bomb first, bombed Washington, D.C., and now the eastern and central part of the U.S. are ruled by Germany and the western states by Japan. I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Sounds interesting.
The the premise is interesting, but by the time you finish the first season, you'll probably wish you hadn't. They don't tie it up very well, in my opinion. Okay, thanks, Seth. We appreciate you.
Oh, thank you, sir.
All right, Seth, we have another one of our, another person here in our group, Gene. Gene has a question for you. Gene, it's all yours.
Thank you, Seth. I appreciate you coming on. I never even knew who you were until Ron and I are good friends, shared this situation or your thing and did a little research on you. Can I kind of address something you answered in regard to And you must have heard this before. It's called the moral argument. You know what that is, obviously. And so my question to you is, and you made some commentary that it's necessary to be altruistic in our society that help to, humanity to move along. But would you not agree that there are some societies in the world where looking out for oneself has actually benefited them, and that's why nobody else goes to those sorts of cultures or anything like that? And you understand what I'm saying? There's some cultures that any outsider we're going to kill. We're not going to let them in here. You understand what I'm saying?
Well, I never said that we required altruistic behavior, but what I was trying to communicate is that cooperative behavior, being good to someone or helping other people, actually was a way of surviving, of culling resources, and everybody wins when you do that. And certainly there are exceptions. I do think, though, if you're talking about communities that have fortified, this is a great example of when tribalism goes too far. We are tribal, right? We're tribal by nature. And, then if you other or outgroup someone else, you are then making things terrible for them, but you're still protecting the tribe. And, I think you look at that as an example of tribalism, not an indictment of humanism.
All right. I can tell you're very, very informed as well as very reasonable individual as far as your thought process. I noticed you've mentioned this a couple of times. I have a very close friend of mine who came out as far as his lifestyle choice 2 or 3 years ago, and I'm still kind of battling with that. But he is still one of my best friends, and I love him to death. Just like it appears that you have that same feeling for your friend. And I think I'm kind of confused that, because at least and I've been a Christian since I was 16. In my experience, whether their person's gay, black, right, left, conservative, liberal, we love them. We may not agree with them, but we still love them. So I'm not sure. I'm not saying that you're closed-minded as far as your relationship with those individuals, but I think in my world, I don't feel that I'm closed-minded. Maybe I'm where you were before you changed to atheism. So that's part of my concern. But another question I have, and I'm sorry I haven't done research. I know at some point you made the decision to become an atheist. You didn't talk about it here. Do you mind sharing? Because I haven't read your book and I don't know what caused it. Do you mind sharing?
I'm making a couple of notes. Okay. Yeah. No, I'd be on it. I'll try to keep this tight. First of all, I think I disagree with your premise that your friend is gay because of a lifestyle choice. I don't think they chose to be gay. Non-heterosexuality is common throughout the animal kingdom. Humans, we've seen hundreds of animal species that are demonstrably non-heterosexual. Everything from the bonobo to the bottlenose dolphin to the mallard duck to the giraffe. You'll find same-sex coupling, throughout the animal kingdom and non-heterosexuality. I mean, your friend didn't wake up one day and decide to be attracted to the same gender. That's already there. I like to say to my heterosexual friends, I'm like, there's a guy, I'm like, when did you wake up and suddenly decide that you were attracted to women? He's like, well, no, I didn't decide. It was just there. I mean, just natural. And I'm like, aha. That's what we're talking about. And I had come out of a fundamentalist faith. We talked in sneering terms about gay people because they had perverted God's law. And this was rooted in Scripture. I mean, I didn't write the Bible, but especially if you pour through the Old Testament, you see example after example of homosexuals being executed, right? Put them to death. If they're having sex with somebody of the same gender, they deserve to be killed. We see the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. It's why gay people have been called, even into our recent history, called sodomites here in this country just a few decades ago. They were known as sodomites. And so, there was a strong cultural attitude that they're broken and they perverted God's ideal for healthy sexuality, godly sexuality. They're fags and homos and all. We had all these slurs that we would throw out. And so, that was the culture I came out of. But I know that a lot of believers don't have that experience. and have been much more accepting and haven't had that sort of bigotry instilled in them. And so I do acknowledge that you're correct. A lot of believers have no interest in othering gay people for being non-heterosexual. As far as me, you'd also, and I disagree with this premise as well, you said when you decided to become an atheist. Well, I didn't choose not to believe in God. It's like I could stand on my roof and say, I choose not to believe in gravity. Well, I can make that declaration, but I know if I step off the roof, I'm going down. You know, the belief's already there. For me, I realized this makes no sense to me. This is not adding up. Historically, scientifically, morally, the dominoes have fallen. This is not tenable. I just had to give myself permission to acknowledge the non-belief that was already there. It started back in the mid-90s when I was in Christian radio. Rich Mullins, famous Christian artist, was killed in a terrible car wreck. I was charged to go on the air and talk about how God had called him home. And the whole scenario made no sense to me. And I thought, we're just making up a happy ending. You know, he's in heaven. There's no pain. We'll all be together. Kumbaya. 9/11 is huge. I saw everybody invoking God when mostly I just saw action and reaction. And finally, I went back to the Bible. You know, I started there, Genesis 1:1, and reread the Bible, not as a love letter, but I began to read it more critically without as much fear. And then I did a comparative religions thing where I looked at other major religions. And at the end of the game, I just had to admit to myself what was already there. I don't buy this. This doesn't make any sense. And that was scary, you know, because I still had an emotional connection to the religion. Will I lose my family? Will I lose my job? My employers were devout believers. What if I'm wrong about hell? I don't want to burn. You know, that kept me up at night for a long, long time. You know, it took me it's like waking up from a coma. You know, it took a long, long time. And so, you know, it was a difficult journey, but I think most of it is not about deciding I'm going to reject God, but admitting to yourself, I've looked at it and it doesn't make sense to me and I'm not convinced. Therefore, I do not believe in a God. And I think that's the difference.
Seth, I want to thank you very much. I don't want to take anybody else's time because I'm sure there's lots of great questions, but
I appreciate you, Gene. Thank you.
I look forward to hearing from you again and maybe having more conversations. Thank you very much for letting me talk.
I'm honored, my friend. Thank you. Good to meet you.
Nice meeting you.
Thank you so much for that. Dan is getting our next question together. So while he's lining them up, I want to ask you, Seth, would you say that the scientific method is the only way that we can come to know if something is true or not?
You know, I don't know. I just think it's the best tool we have. You know, you have the hypothesis and you go through the process of experimentation and I just think I'm not sure that I'm looking around for another process. Like, what would that other process be if you weren't following the breadcrumbs and then testing the data? And I'm not sure what that process would look like. But I think if we're in the business of seeking knowledge over belief, right? It's called faith because it's not knowledge, if I can quote Christopher Hitchens. Then I think the scientific method probably makes the most sense. But I mean, if somebody comes up with a better method, I think the rationalist has to say, okay, what is it? Does it work? Let's use it if it does, you know.
Thank you so much for that. We have a question from one of our longtime former Christian. In fact, he was a Wycliffe Bible translator in Africa, believer. Now he is an atheist, or we'll say non-believer. I won't put the label on him. I'll let him do that. But Ken had a question. Ken, you're up, buddy.
Hey, thanks, Brady, and thanks, Seth, for coming on. It's a real honor to have somebody like you in our group today.
Thanks, Ken.
Yeah, and I happen to be the same age as you, so and I enjoyed listening to your audiobook. I would much rather do that than read text. Hear a radio announcer, true radio announcer. So really love your voice and everything. So, so my question is, and full disclosure, I'm a liberal, just like you, pretty much, sort of moderate liberal, but not conservative. You mentioned that some atheists are politically conservative for fiscal reasons. However, in my view, Trump has not demonstrated a great deal of fiscal conservatism. Yet many atheists are Trump supporters, including several in this club. I'm interested in knowing both your and their perspective on what primarily drives their support for Trump, other than fiscal conservatism.
Oh, my gosh. How much hate mail do you want me to get, Ken? I mean, come on. You set me up, my friend. Well, I can't speak to all of the specific reasons that people gravitate to Trump. They don't fit on a bumper sticker. I've met people who they're just upset with the system, and maybe they think that the whole Benghazi thing with Hillary was legit, and so that's their touchstone issue, and so that propelled them to Trump. Or maybe they bought the idea that he genuinely was a self-made man and a business genius, and so that propelled them. I've heard the, hey, he's not a politician argument by some people, so that propelled them. I have met a few who are anti-abortion, and so since he switched actually from pro-choice to anti-abortion when it became politically expedient for him to do so, and so that's their issue. So there are a lot of reasons, but I'm interested in Donald Trump from a social perspective. I see an appeal to authoritarianism when it comes to Donald Trump. He is one of these guys, for many people, believer and non-believer, they seem to be attracted to the idea that he acts like a king instead of a president. You know, the rule of law, the Constitution, whatever, I'm going to do what I got to do to get things done. And so they've decided sort of in this cult of personality that he's their guy. Now, I do think this is much stronger among evangelical conservatives. And I do believe that their lean into authoritarianism is religiously motivated. This is a culture that is primed to rally behind savior figures. How often have we heard God's name invoked? Right? He called himself the chosen one. Rick Perry called him the chosen one. The people on the Evangelical Advisory Board believe he's the chosen one. He's a savior figure who's been put in place by God as part of divine destiny. And so people who respond then to authoritarian type figures, they, in some ways, I think, can then shut off their moral reasoning centers and they can just focus on obedience and allegiance. And so they line up. They haven't really done their homework on Donald Trump. This is true, I think, across the board, liberal and conservative, but I see a lot of, well, he's this. And then you go and you correct the record and you're like, well, actually, he's not. You know, it's interesting when you go back and you see that his own autobiographer, his ghostwriter, admitted, Tony Schwartz said he made up almost everything in The Art of the Deal, the best-selling book about his success in business. And you read about the business failures when he was no longer under his father's purview, and the predation on women is tremendously toxic attitude about other human beings, certainly something Jesus would reject if Jesus was here on this earth. You see the constant using and lying and predation on other human beings and the gleeful bullying, the malignant narcissism, all those types of things. You know, there is a culture, I think, that thinks, well, you know what, if he's God's guy, then he's my guy. Beyond that, in the atheist movement, I have a harder time figuring it out. Maybe they're single issue voters. Maybe they genuinely believe he's a great businessman. I struggle with it. I don't see a ton of Trump supporters, but I do see some, and they're certainly very vocal. I hope I remotely answered your question there. I was sort of splintering off in 5 different directions. Ken?
Yeah, and I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but if anybody wanted to speak up who does support Trump as a non-believer, I'm genuinely curious to know what kind of the main reasons are, or just one main reason. I think would suffice.
Like I heard someone say, Ken, that we teach our children. Let's say you have sons, and you're going to. I'm going to teach my son how to grow up and be a good man, how to be a man. Right? Let's say we put it in that context. What do we teach them? You know what? Don't be the guy on the playground that kicks sand in somebody else's face and beats them up. You need to go in there and be an advocate for the little guy. Don't ever let anybody else be bullied. You need to go in there and do the right thing. And always tell the truth. Don't lie to people. And you need to respect women. You need to be respectful to women and your other human beings on this planet. And you know what? If you give your word, you need to keep your word. And if you make a deal, you need to make good on that deal. And you need to just go out and try to make the world a better place. We say this because we want our young boys to grow up and be men. I saw an article that said, by that standard, Donald Trump is the least manly man who has ever been in the office of the presidency, because he is gleefully cruel to other people. On a day-by-day basis, he enjoys the cruelty, and so do many of his followers. His attitudes about other human beings, especially women, he is not an advocate for the little guy. He is a guy with a golden toilet who lives in tremendous opulence and luxury, surrounded by other fat cats, totally insulated from the challenges of the real world and totally uninterested in doing right by other people. This is anti-humanism. So I struggle with it among rationalists, quote unquote rationalists or atheists, because I think I don't think you can support a man like that and enable a man like that and be an advocate for your fellow human beings, be a true humanist, because he represents the antithesis of true humanism.
Thank you.
You got me wound up, Ken. That's what happens. You push that button and 5 minutes goes by. Sorry about that.
Hey, I'm just glad Ken's not doing it to us Christians right now. That's the best part. So
he's a pit bull, man. He's a tiger.
He's getting everybody.
Coming up next, I fielded a question about the origins of the Jesus story. How do I explain it? Where did Jesus Christ come from? And how do I explain the longevity and popularity of the Christ story? We talk about it next. Hang on. This is more of my Q&A. I fielded questions and challenges from Christians and atheists on this rebroadcast of the Atheist Christian Book Club. They are online at atheistchristianbookclub.com.
Hey, we got another question for you, Seth. This comes from Watchman's own Dan Ray. Dan, take it away, buddy.
Seth, thank you for coming.
Yeah.
And I have to say, I've been listening to you for a while as a Christian, and as a fellow broadcaster, I'm envious of your smooth radio voice.
You're very kind. Thank you.
Thanks for coming on. It's nice to talk to you finally in person and to have you here, and we're grateful for it. A question just reading in the section in your book today about the part where you go into a little bit of background about the Bible. Just some thoughts about historical reasoning came to mind, and I'll just be brief. What for you, because it really wasn't specific in the book, and maybe you can go into a little bit of more detail here. What for you is the best historical explanation for the origin of Christianity? How do you see that? How have you reconciled that particular aspect?
Well, I see a ton of political expediency, certainly in the first few centuries. And beyond that, I'm not arguing, I'm not addressing the argument from popularity. I think part of your question may be, what's my explanation for how it has endured and become so prevalent and popular over 2,000 years? Am I misreading your question?
Well, it's part of it, but really the gist of it was, how do you, simplified, how do you think it started?
Oh gosh, I've heard the mythicist argument. I've heard the literal Jesus argument, and I've read about both, and I don't know. I don't know if there was a real guy who walked the earth, a real Jesus, a charismatic figure, a teacher, preacher, whatever, that the legend's based on. I don't know if it was based on previous celestial deities, and these were all borrowed from other previous gods, pagan and otherwise. I don't know what other religious or political traditions help to promote or propagate that. I do see, though, that we have to go past whether or not it caught fire and is popular and say, well, can we take it to its source and verify that it actually happened? And for me, that question is an absolute and easy no. And so, regardless of it, was there a real Jesus and how did it start? I simply do not know. Nobody knows, even if they profess to know. But beyond that, we can then look beyond and say, well, are the claims of the Bible something that you can then take to the bank as absolutes, historical, scientific, and moral truth? And you can pretty quickly, in my opinion, say, no, there are more reliable sources.
Okay, thanks for answering.
Yeah.
We have another question here from another one of our Christian members, George. George, the floor is yours, my friend. You might have to. There you go.
Hi, Seth. Thanks so much for being with us this evening, coming to join us. My question was about Jesus. So a minute ago, you said something about an opinion that Jesus might have had about Donald Trump's actions. And I tend to agree with that statement, but it got me thinking. I'm curious what your opinion is about Jesus, specifically. Well, assuming he's real, let's agree with Bart Ehrman on this one, who says that the mythicists make atheists look foolish and that Jesus was a real historical figure. Let's just assume that for the sake of the question.
Yeah.
Which of Jesus' teachings do you agree with, and which would you disagree with?
Well, I mean, you can I can make the Bible do anything you want it to do. And that includes the teachings of Jesus. I mean, if you want a hate book, I can make it do that. I can find you a verse. If you want it to be a love book, we got that. If you want it to be a bigotry book, we can do that. If you want it to be a diversity and acceptance book, I can do that. And the same's true with Jesus. And, many of the teachings of Christ, if you were to look at them at face value, I think there are some things, obviously, that's not all that original, but you could take the teachings about thankfulness, about, I don't know necessarily if I agree with loving your enemies, but I don't think that running around hating all the time is a way to live your life, to do good, to be charitable, to be kind, to think of the poor, to think of the least of these. I mean, you can find meritorious teachings from Jesus Christ. The challenge that we have is this is also the same Jesus out of the book of Matthew, who admitted that I've not come to bring peace. I came to bring a sword. I've come to turn a father against his son, a mother against her daughter, right? A man's enemies will be the members of his own household. Jesus commanded, he said, if you have to be prepared to hate your family members on my behalf, or you're not worthy of me. Well, what kind of worthy deity comes down and says, you know what, I'm prepared to split you guys and your family up because if I don't win this popularity contest, you're not worthy of me as a savior. Well, that's a problem. The Bible tells us that Jesus and God are the same, right? The Holy Trinity, Jesus, God, the Spirit. If Jesus and God are the same, that means Jesus is also the author of hell, right? Hellfire, depart from me, all you who are cursed, into a lake of fire and everlasting damnation. What kind of a worthy, benevolent God creates a torture chamber that will cook you forever? So, there's a beautiful, wonderful, kind, benevolent Jesus, and then there's the awful author of hell Jesus, and they both exist in the same Bible.
I think that answers my question. Thank you.
No, thank you. I haven't been cussed out yet. I feel like
hopefully you won't be. That's not our aim, at least, anyway.
Like, we're having respectful dialogue. It's weird. I mean, and we're using the internet to do it. Did Nostradamus predict this? Is this written somewhere? Is this a prophecy fulfilled?
Absolutely.
A miracle, Seth. It's a miracle, and you're
it's
a part
of it. It's a modern-day miracle.
It really is, but I guess
that's what everybody put it on the internet yet. That's right. Well, we have that's usually a lot of first-time guest reaction. How in the world do you guys do this? Do you give your guests
Seth,
something to pay them? What do you do?
I don't know. Everybody's on their best behavior. Let me ask you this, because we do have another question that just popped up. And this question will kind of lead into to Brad's question. And I don't know Brad. I'm sorry, so I can't give any kind of introduction. But would you say then that you hold to subjective morality? I know you mentioned the Christian apologist, objective standard of morality argument. Would you then hold that morality is subjective? Then I'm going to let Brad ask his question. You can just give a short answer.
I would frame morality from the perspective of we act to minimize harm. This idea that Can there be an objective moral standard? I would probably lean a little bit more into, it is a case by case, somewhat subjective. I mean, it's situational. Here's a great example. If the Bible tells me do not bear false witness, don't lie. Okay, fine. Well, there's an abuse victim and she's come over to my house and I let her inside and I'm keeping her safe and I lock the door and her husband's got a .45 and he's looking for her and he comes and he pounds on the door. Now, is the moral thing to not lie and say, hey, she's right here, come get her, or she's right here, whatever? Or would the moral thing be to say, I'm not home, to not answer, not be home, to say, no, she's not here, to eliminate the threat? And so that doesn't fit in a cookie cutter, right? I have borne false witness at the moment, but I actually did a moral thing which helped to minimize harm. And so I think, this is kind of how I approach moral, ethical decisions in this life. Are we acting as best we can to minimize harm?
Thanks, Seth. Brad, you're up, and I hope I didn't step too much on your question, but I'll let you go a little bit if you want to kind of re-explain that a little bit more to Seth in terms of your question. It's all you, Brad. You're up.
I appreciate that, Brady. And Seth, thank you for being a part of the program.
Yeah, thank you.
I guess, to follow up, if there is no objective standard of morality, isn't it just more of a personal opinion? Or even maybe to take it a step further, would it be kind of the majority rules? And if the majority rules we've seen in society where a majority can kind of go off the rails. So it can, if there is no objective standard of morality, then my perception is it's more just a matter of personal opinion at that point.
Well, I don't know that you and I could see somebody beating or raping someone else and as people with evolved ethical systems, with evolved moral systems, not know that is destructive behavior. I understand the argument is, well, if I can just decide that rape is okay without an objective moral standard, how would I know where the line was drawn? But I don't look at it in those terms. I look at it in terms of, if we are evolved as cooperative beings, or largely cooperative beings, and we see harm being done, I think we will recognize that harm being done. I don't know that I reject this notion that there is an objective moral standard bearer. That sort of, it's not even a theistic argument. It's a deistic argument that some other out in the cosmos must have put this sort of foundation in place and we all must lean on it. I see it more in terms of, is this genuinely harming someone? Is it causing pain or destruction or distress or, in some other injury? And I think you can assess that and determine that it is wrong on merit.
Brad, was that good for you?
He answered the question. Yep, I'm fine. Thanks. Appreciate that.
Well, thanks for the question.
All right. I think Terry has a word. Terry is a longtime member of our group, and I'll let her speak up. She comes more from the atheist side of things.
Absolutely, on the atheist side of the group, and you questioned about Trump. So I'll go with that because I'm the one person in the club that is a Trump supporter. That's also, and my husband. And I will be perfectly honest. When I started listening to your debate or your podcast with Shannon, I listened about 15 or 20 minutes and then I turned it off. And I even texted James and said, yikes, this is, how much more anger can we see? So you want to know. And then Ken asked the same question. Why would someone support Trump? So I look at his accomplishments. And you may say, well, there aren't any accomplishments. He has 3 Nobel Peace.
5 nominations.
5 nominations for peace in the Middle East. We have had no wars since he took office. He has done more for the black community than any other president, including our black president. Am I pro-life? Yes, but do I really think that that's my opinion? But whatever someone wants to do, I think that's perfectly fine. I don't want to pay for it. So let's take the government funding abortion out of the picture, and I'm okay with it. Do what you want. But I don't think it's right to have someone who has different views forced to spend their money in a way that disagrees with their moral. Because, since we want to be moral, we might want to talk about the morality of babies. So that's just my opinion. You ask about somebody made a question about Clinton and we were all upset because of Clinton's treatment of women, and yet we just stand back about Trump. I don't think anybody cared what Clinton did before he was president with women. I mean, that was his issue, and it wasn't an issue that affected the country. Having sex with your intern while you are president is a different thing in the Oval Office. Trump has done nothing but support women throughout his entire 4 years. You can do that by looking at Kayleigh McElroy. You can look at Kellyanne Conway. You can look at Nikki Haley. The list goes on and on of women that he put in important positions in his administration, much more so than anyone else. And you talk about, he's a liar, or he's this or that. If you think, or not just, I'm not saying this to you. I'm not pointing this at you. But if anyone thinks that he is as much or more of a liar than Obama was to his during his administration, then you haven't done I can say just as easily that you haven't done your homework. So I think that's kind of what I feel is kind of interesting is that as a liberal atheist, the most important thing is to disagree and to say that, if you're a conservative and you support Trump, you haven't done your homework. You just fall into a belief of following an authoritarian person. And that is not the appeal that Trump has to his supporters. And if you think it is, that's where you, and again, the you is not you individually, but it's where you're not looking at what his supporters are saying about him.
And they're half the whole
United States. And we're half the whole United States. So anyway, if the question is, why would someone who is an atheist and who seems to be a moral person also support President Trump? That's why.
Okay. Well, I'd like to respond, if I may. First of all, anybody can be nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. The nomination means almost nothing. Secondly, Donald Trump has displayed tremendous ambivalence about the rising up of people, black and across the color spectrum, who are protesting in the wake of racial injustice. And if I think that much of an advocate for people who are people of color, it would, I think, translate into more than he has in terms of the black vote. I believe that about 80% of black Americans actually are voting against him. I get the idea of voting, not wanting tax dollars. I mean, I understand your position if you don't want your tax dollars to be funneled into reproductive choice issues. And I think in a lot of ways, the fact that you hold a specific stance, but you aren't telling someone else how to live their lives, in that way, you may actually be pro-choice. We probably have that in common. How someone acts before, I think, can help inform who they are. I mean, if we look at patterns of behavior, Donald Trump is not the man. He did not become the man he is day one of his presidency. He has been hugely problematic from the earliest days. I read Dr. Mary Trump's book about his formative years, his upbringing under a sociopathic father, and the cultivating of cruelty, nonstop cruelty. So the things that he does and has a pattern of doing over long decades, they do inform who he is. They do help explain how he is. So this is the guy who's cruising through the dressing rooms of teenage girls because he can, and he's proud of it. And, he's the guy who says you got to treat women like, I'm not going to say the S word because this is a specifically religious, partially religious audience, but he just said it. That's a quote. You got to treat him like S. You see somebody who displays a tremendous amount of cruelty toward other people in the pettiness and the name calling and the nastiness. And I don't think it's unfair to see the long pattern of that behavior and also see how it informs his behavior today. Now, it looks like we see the man, we're seeing him through two completely different lenses. To clarify, I don't believe that everyone who responds to Trump is following the authoritarian lead. But there is a cult allegiance to Donald Trump. Cult expert Stephen Hassan has a great book about this. It's called The Cult of Trump. And it speaks to how cult leaders are charismatic figures. They're often malignant narcissists, how they control the flow of information and teach you to distrust all disconfirming information. They demand absolute loyalty and allegiance. They surround themselves with in-group symbols, and they love walls and borders, right? You are essentially othering everybody else and operating from this specific cocoon. Donald Trump, from my perspective and the perspective of cult experts like Hassan, he is a cult member, and he has people who are acting in very cult-ish, sort of almost religious ways. I'm not saying you are, but I'm saying that there is a tremendous number of people out there who are treating this in an almost kind of a religious exercise on the following of the Savior. I'm not saying that's you, but I'm saying that those people are out there. They do exist, and they exist in significant numbers.
Right, and there are a lot of people out there in mainstream media who wrap themselves in many, many numbers, in the same amount of numbers, who are against him for reasons that other people don't understand.
Terry, do you think it's possible that a guy like me could have a legitimate moral gripe against the guy? I mean, do you think that someone like me could look at him and have legitimate concerns? Sure. I'm not saying that. I'm not trying to say that you don't, that you shouldn't have your own opinion. But at the same time, could you say that someone like me could look at him and say, I don't really have a moral issue with him. I think he's done wonderful things. He backs the police department. I hear some of the things you are describing more like people who irrationally worship Obama. So it's just how you look at it, and I think there's no doubt that we can be tribal, and politics is no exception. I won't argue the point that there are people who have been really allegiant to Obama. Now, Obama, I believe, in my own life, represents more my value system.
I'm sure
he's more xenophilic. He is less inclined to represent this country with borders and walls. I think he is, it was during his presidency that LGBT marriage was made legal and upheld by the Supreme Court. And he was there to celebrate that as a human rights issue. I think he's the adult in the room. I think he represents the democratic process. I think Donald Trump, from my perspective, is operating more like a king than he is a president. And I think there are people who enjoy that. And, they respond to kingly type figures. And even though you're not one of them, I'm simply making the observation that those people do exist.
Well, there you go. But the question was, how can, why would someone support Donald Trump? So I took the opportunity to tell you why that is.
Fair enough. I appreciate you, Terry. Thank you.
There you go.
Hey, thanks for that, Terry.
Thank you, guys. We're closing up on time. James, we have a couple of...
let me go ahead and have something I wanted to drop in there, and I think we can go... We still got a little bit more time, I believe, on that. So let me go ahead and had a question for you, Seth. in your book, you talked about, quote, hundreds of presidential statements bear out this fact as he, talking about Trump, blasts his enemies, real or perceived, with insults like loser, dumb, weak, and pathetic. A few of his own words. I think you referred to his Twitter feed earlier as being Exhibit A in making that case. And I will say, listen, I was one of the evangelical leaders in 2016 that was invited to Times Square to ask questions, and I wanted to like the guy a lot. And there are things that I'll pray for him, but there's things that he does that just grates on me. And so I can agree with you as far as some of the language he uses and things like that. That it's you want to defend, even if you want to defend, it's kind of hard to defend. But then the option you're giving back to us, though, in your book, it seems to not have a very kind of fair or bright outlook either. So it's like just the use of adjectives. So there's one I want to ask you about. Your own words, the adjectives you use to describe Fox News Christians. Here's some of them: racist, petty, cruel, angry, paranoid, ignorant, bigoted, bombastic, xenophobic, race-baiting, misogynistic, angry, prejudiced, and my favorite, intolerant. It seems.
Now, let me stop you for just a second, James. I don't know that I made a statement in there saying that all Fox News watchers or Fox News Christians are those things. So,
Christian nationalist sometimes is the term that you use, but
Did you scan my book and take specific criticisms that are situational and then make a laundry list, or because I didn't write a paragraph saying that Fox News Christians are by default these things.
You didn't. And some of it you'd be talking about things that happened, during the times of slavery or something like that. So, obviously this predates Fox News. So I'm not trying to say that you were making the case that only Fox News Christians, maybe conservative Christians or maybe Bible believing Christians. But I don't think I missed the fact that it seemed like throughout the book those kinds of adjectives were used pretty regularly. So, and listen, I wasn't really offended by that because I don't think you were talking directly to me on a lot of it, maybe most of it. And I'm kind of used to being called intolerant. I mean, I do believe Jesus is the only way. So I guess maybe that's part of the job description of being a Christian is you're supposed to be considered intolerant. But I'm not hearing what seems to me like a lot of tolerance coming from the other direction. So what I kind of thought there would be is like a rescue helicopter coming to help us, poor misled people out. But what I found instead was a gunship coming in to mow us down is what it felt like to me. So and maybe I missed the whole point and that's just my perspective. But did anybody else feel that way? Was I just alone on that?
Well, I'd like to speak to it if I may.
Sure.
I was really talking a lot about myself. I was that guy. I was a bigot. I was a racist. And I was that guy. And the terms that you've thrown out, I use in specific context. And no time during the book do I take the whole of all Fox News Christians and call them these things in this way.
And let me say, too, I do appreciate the chapter 13. And this was a great way of trying to balance out the rest of the book, that you weren't just saying that you agree with everything liberal and disagree with everything this conservative.
Yeah,
you did a good job of that.
The book was not meant as a life raft I think this speaks to perhaps the earlier question that I did a poor job of answering or didn't answer completely. The book is not a life raft for people who I think it will disabuse them of whatever they're thinking if they are doxastically closed. It's really more of an exploration of the culture for those who either come out of it, who don't understand it because they've never been in it, or maybe are perhaps even looking over I have a lot of people who are international readers looking over the shores. It's an examination of what it is, but it's not exactly I'm going to get you out of this. It's a revelation from my perspective as to what it is, how it informed my thinking, my attitudes, my worldview at the time. But, you're right. And if there's a criticism that it doesn't do enough to perhaps I don't know, it's not written as a persuasive book. It's really more of an anecdotal book, a personal biography. And it also, I think, lays out a lot of the specifics about the culture itself. And this is fact-based, where Fox came from, who the key players are, what they specifically say, footnoted, bookmarked quotes that you can go back and verify, and then the culture
I felt like
that surrounds
was the strongest part of the book. The whole background to the founding fathers of Fox News and kind of the history behind it. I felt to be. I knew some of that, but it was some of it was a revelation to me.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if I didn't provide enough of an escape hatch, that's a fair criticism for sure.
Yeah. So, I'm not trying to say that the use of harsh criticism, even sarcasm, is not a valid tool to use in some cases. But again, it's not. It doesn't seem to be the antidote to intolerance. Is the style of it didn't seem it to be to me.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Coming up next. And I'll admit that I expected this sooner in the conversation. I was encouraged to do my research. We've seen this a lot out there on the internet. I'll let you listen in to the exchange and decide how you feel about it. We'll do it on the other side of this. My patrons get the show totally commercial-free. If you're not a patron and you'd like to become one, you can log on to patreon.com/Seth Andrews. And this is the final segment of my Q&A on the rebroadcast from the Atheist and Christian Book Club.
James, we have somebody, Dennis, has a couple of questions he'd like to ask you. Yeah. Seth? Dennis, if you are unmuted, are you there? You ready to go?
I am. I appreciate it so much. Can you hear me okay? This is my first time on, so I appreciate it.
Welcome.
Seth, I just wanted to compliment you. I'm impressed with your voice. Voice, just tremendous, and I can see why you've been so successful in the media. Just wonderful voice, and
Thank you.
Kind of draws people in. So that's really special. I apologize that I have not read your book and don't know exactly what all you shared with regard to how you turned away from Christianity. I understand you shared a little bit about your parents and growing up in the church and so forth. Really concerned about that, and I'm sorry about that. And I know those things happen to people. I certainly hope you do your research and review. I wanted to share one thing which might be helpful. There was a guy, his name was Simon Greenleaf. You might have heard of him. Does that ring a bell at all?
No.
Okay. He was a Harvard University professor. He was extensively involved in the creation of their law school. He wrote a 3-volume study. It was called An Examination of the Testimony of the 4 Evangelists by the Rules of Evidence Administered by the Courts of Justice. And after he wrote that, he said that he believed in the resurrection. So, again, I'm not trying to, I just wanted you to have an additional resource out there. I'd say one thing, God loves you. And it's hard to answer all the questions about the Bible. There are a lot of things that people study and they don't come up with all the answers. But I will say, I think I've read enough that I believe in God's love. And I think that's the most important thing that we can take away is that we were created out of God's love. And because of that love, he then found a way for us to come back to him, and that was through Jesus Christ. Now, you've heard all that, and you know all that, and everybody on here has heard all that. But again, that's in simplistic view kind of what's going on. But it's just really sad, and I'm sorry about that. But we could talk more about that at some point in the future. But I hope you do some research. One thing I was really surprised that we tended to turn this to Trump as opposed to talking about how you turned away and about Fox News. And I was sort of surprised at that. And obviously things go the way they go. And so you have to follow the flow of the conversation. But I know Fox News has changed a little bit recently. You may have heard that they had the outnumbered segment, and somebody brought up George Soros, and they were told that they couldn't pursue that topic any further, so they didn't talk about George Soros. And I think if it had been the old Fox News, they probably would have gone down that path. But Fox News has changed a little bit, and they're continuing to change. Just wanted to share a couple of things about Trump. I didn't really want it to go in the direction of Trump because I can see a lot of anger, I think, in your face and in your voice that you really don't like Trump, and a lot of people don't like Trump. He's not, he's got a huge ego, and a lot of people dislike all the stupid stuff that he's done. He's definitely a flawed individual. But if you look at the policies and look at the things that he's accomplished and the way he stands, do we really want to defund the police? Do we really want to go down the pathway toward socialism, Marxism, and those type issues? And again, those are different policy issues, but I like the idea of a smaller government and less regulation. And I like a strong military. I served in the military, and I think we have a lot of freedoms because of our focus on God with our founding fathers, and also our focus on having a strong military. And I apologize for taking up so much of your time, but I enjoyed the opportunity to listen to you guys, and this was a great experience, and I enjoyed hearing what you shared, Seth.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it. Would you
Seth,
like me to respond to any of that, or I don't know how we're doing for time?
Yeah. Let's take at least a minute or two to unpack that a little bit, Seth.
There's a lot to unpack. First of all, the phrasing "you turned away from Christianity," I get that. I understand where that comes from. But more, it's that I just realized that there was no there. And I appreciate that. I really do receive that, that God loves you. And I receive that from which the Spirit it is intended. Honestly, we have to see that Jesus is a hugely problematic character. God is the God of the Bible, right? First of all, we can't verify who wrote any of the 66 books of the Bible. None. Nobody knows for sure. The Gospels that chronicle the life of Christ, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, we don't know the authors of those books. They vary wildly on the stories of Jesus. The Jesus is depicted. They were born differently. They lived differently. They died differently. They taught and said different things in different ways. And again, you've got these wild claims that simply cannot be verified. Popularity or no, mass delusion is still delusion. So we need more than just, I know it in my heart or Jesus speaks to me, for me to find the Jesus argument compelling. And I simply have not. Speaking to the political issue, it's interesting. The people who freak out about democratic socialism are the same people who enjoy public schools and public libraries and police and fire and, the basic necessities that communities do for each other. I think the right has effectively weaponized scare words like socialism. Biden is not a socialist. He does support nationalized healthcare, but also privatized. But he's only been called that because it is an effective political weapon against him. Now, I don't love Biden. He's not a good candidate. He's better than I think the alternative. But this idea that he is a socialist it's a lie propagated as a political chess move. Also, defund the police is a terrible brand for another idea, which is reform the police. They want to take funding out of some of law enforcement and put it into social programs so that you're not sending armed officers into specific domestic situations. My taking the left to task for that is something I have done often because it's just a terrible brand. The people who came up with defund the police are doing a terrible job of actually describing what that means. And of course, the right has picked up on it and says we want to abolish cops. We don't want law and order, that type of thing, or that we're anti-military, that type of thing. A lot of those are just misnomers. They've been weaponized against people who are not Republicans, but they are not necessarily rooted in the reality of it. So anyway, there was a lot going on there, but those were the two major things that I just sort of, I was able to recall that I wanted to respond to.
Thanks so much, Seth. Our own Daniel Ray has another question. Daniel.
Seth, it's been a lot of fun talking to you and listening to you and having you on, and I've gotten a different perspective just hearing you tonight than I do, because, you know, in this world of sound bites and videos, I mean, you know, you've been in the media. Sometimes we get canceled for 10 seconds of a quote we said in a video 10 years ago. And so I have to admit, I've developed a certain kind of perspective of you just from your online persona, which I know being in media, it's not necessarily the same. So I thank you for allowing yourself to be vulnerable and open to our group, because it's kind of scary for the first time. And I've really gotten to have a better appreciation for you as a person just coming on and doing this. So thanks.
Oh, yeah.
And I mean that. And so thanks. I wanted to just, maybe we could speak on this and unpack this, if you will. A couple of times in your book, you had mentioned the word truth, and I'll just use this particular quote. I don't know what page it is. I have the Kindle, so pardon me for not knowing the page exactly. You say that cooperation is good for others, which in turn is good for us. You've spoken about that already. Association conquers alienation. Friendship conquers prejudice. Humility conquers hubris. We can pursue truth beyond mere claims, and I would agree with that. And would you be able to unpack what you perceive to be truth? What are we mutually pursuing? What is your idea or concept of truth?
Well, I don't speak about truth like I used to speak about truth when I was religious, like truth with a capital T, like the truth. Like it's, you know, I think we're trying to develop what I call a personal relationship with reality. Let's root our feet on the ground and let's find out what makes sense and what does the evidence show us, and let's pursue that. You know, beyond wish thinking and beyond conspiracy thinking and beyond magical thinking. Well, let's try to get past that and let's find out what's real. And so when I talk about trying to find the truth, you know, that's really what I'm saying. Let's try to figure out. And I'll tell you, I think we have to do a better job of giving ourselves permission to simply say, I don't know, when we don't know. Because people don't like to be unsure. We hate not knowing. We hate not having the answer. Sometimes we'll fill in the blanks just so there's no blank. And I think, you know, while we're pursuing the answers and trying to figure out how everything works, the gears in the machine out there, living life honestly to do that, if we don't know, I think we have to be candid and transparent. Say, you know, I just don't know the answer. You know, we train our children. You know, when they're in class, one of their greatest fears is to be called on when there's an answer they don't know. And we train that into them, right? They're terrified. What if I don't know? And we kill curiosity in people. We start early. And I think, you know, I wish for people a curious life. Let's go ask the questions. Even if we don't get good answers, let's continue to ask. And we'll ask again, and we'll keep asking. And once we get the answer, we continue to test those answers. And so when I say let's find the truth, let's just find out what's real, whatever that is, and be prepared to follow the evidence wherever it may take us.
So you do ascribe to some form of reality having some kind of objective truth about it. So you're not
I mean, you know,
postmodern
like
in that regard.
You know, this coffee cup is ceramic. You know, that's true because, I see the composition of the cup and it's filled with coffee and I'm using it as a coffee cup. You know, I think you approach the world by sort of testing and retesting and using the scientific method to try to find out, what's true. Now, that I'm not speaking about philosophical truths or religious truths, those types of things. But, you know, I think some people say that religion and science are supposed to be compatible, you know, and I disagree. I think religion that's still a scientific question. If you're going to tell me that there is a deity somewhere, and that there is a spiritual membrane and I have a soul and all those other things, that has to be demonstrated. You're going to have to come up with a way for that to be tested and tested in a way where it is absolutely provable. Your faith claim simply won't do it for me. Your personal experience, your leaning on the book. I don't understand why any benevolent God needs an apologist. Why would I need to read a human written book to understand God's book? And why did God communicate in a book that's, you know, was written 1400 years before the printing press, blah, blah, blah. I mean, we can get into all that. You know, I'm talking about what's real? Well, let's go out and kick the tires and let's do some experimenting and try to find out if it's real or if it's just imagined, you know.
Okay, so thank you so much for answering that. Last bit of that follow-up, and then I'll pass it along. So let's say we do a scientific test or something, or that we somehow are able to demonstrate God interacting with the world through the empirical scientific means. Would you, Seth, recognize the evidence for divine handiwork if it were extant to us?
Well, you know, it's that's been posited to me before. You know, usually it's presented in a little bit in the form of a jab, like even if it's been proven and it's all around you, you still won't accept it. It's usually something like, it's not how I received it from you, Dan, but I hear it a lot. Here's the interesting idea. All right, God knows everything. God is all powerful. God already knows exactly what it would take to convince me, right? God already knows the specific mechanism that would be required for me to know that he's real. So even if I didn't know what it would take to convince me, God does, and he would be able to do that immediately. And he wouldn't be communicating through ancient text, conflicting text translated over thousands of years, churches that are splintered into thousands of conflicting denominations where they can't even agree on the basics, baptism, eternal security, the literal Genesis, etc. You know, if Saul can have a Damascus Road experience, why can't I? And I've made the promise to my religious friends that if there is a God, I want to know that. Because as I said a minute ago, whatever's real, I want to do that. Now, the question as to whether or not that God is worthy of allegiance and worship, that's a different question. But if there's a God that exists, I definitely want to know that. If it's true, I think we need to be prepared to accept it. And if God is genuinely all-powerful and benevolent, he would already know what it would take to convince all of us, 7 billion of us, and he would be able to do it just like that.
Okay. Yeah, I have just a question, but also maybe an observation first, Seth. In your book, you talked about that there are some moderates or liberals at Fox News, maybe token liberals. But
no, I don't think they're token. Like Chris Wallace, I don't think they're token. But
you seem to say that they were like almost chosen because they were less charismatic or less forthright or less.
I think they're a minority, but I don't know if token's the word, but I get your point.
You specifically mentioned Alan Combs, and I was just going to say, in his defense, I had the dubious privilege of being interviewed on Fox News by Alan Combs. He was extremely tough. Didn't seem to be a pushover in any, but I would have to say very fair. I was very, very sorry to hear of his passing. But do you feel like that the real reason is to set up a paper tiger or something like that? The liberals they have on are just cannon fodder, for the main event.
I think it's apparent in the format how much Sean Hannity invites a non-conservative guest on, but that guest really only exists to give Sean the chance to say what he wants. Right? He talks over him. He cuts him off. He talks over him. He sneers at him. He cuts him off. I mean, time after time, we see that the host is bringing on somebody with a counterpoint of view, but often it has the effect of allowing the host to sort of Bigfoot that person, and then they get a chance to bloviate about what they wanted to say in the first place. There's very little meaningful
dialogue. So the heavyweight champion is looking for a sparring partner.
I don't know if the metaphor I'm trying to think of a great metaphor, but conflict does do a lot for ratings. And I think there is a perception of conservative superiority that permeates most of Fox News, from Fox and Friends to the entire primetime lineup. If you think about Fox's primetime lineup, they're not doing like Shepard Smith type, here's the stories of the day. They're doing editorial content from the perspective of Christian evangelical activists. They are firebrands pushing a specific religion, and they're doing it on a news station. And this resonates so well with American believers, white American Christians specifically, that Fox News has been number one in its ratings quarter for the last 70 quarters consistently. So they're having a lot of success doing it. I just don't think it's a healthy way to approach what's genuinely happening, right?
But you do make
an ideological message, not a factual one in many cases.
Ideological, not factual. But you do make a distinction between the op-ed and the opinion segments versus the straight news, just like you would in the New York Times or the Washington Post.
Yeah, but I mean, we're not seeing Sean Hannity followed by somebody who is doing a counter broadcast to, the equal time thing. You see that Fox News has a consistent narrative of sort of this God and country flag waving evangelical conservatism, and it permeates. I mean, you've got Sean Hannity and Jeanine Pirro and other people who are they're attending religious events around the country. Sean Hannity actually helped fund a Christian film, and he co-starred in it. He had a guest shot in the film. He is about sort of this nation belongs to him and his specific religion and his specific God, othering people who are non-Christians. And if you read the Constitution itself, there's not one mention of God, and the only mention of religion actually separates the church and the state. And there are many people who are God believers, devout Christians, etc., who are fighting alongside me to protect that church-state line, because the government is a lot of things, but it is not a church. It was never the founders' intention to have a Christian nation. We can be a nation with Christians, but we also have Muslims and Hindus and Sikhs and Jainists and atheists and seculars and everybody else. It's a representative republic. And so Fox News is selling the false notion that the whole country belongs to God, and anybody who doesn't fit into that cookie cutter is attacking God. And it's just a false claim.
I did notice that when you talked about God not being in the Constitution, but you didn't reference the Declaration of Independence, which
it's in the Declaration of Independence
bad document.
But when they specifically set up
justification for the whole revolution.
Many of them were religious, and they were invoking their creator, whether colloquially or whether or not they genuinely were devout believers. But when it came to the actual Constitution that provided the foundation, the foundational governing document, the people who were escaping the Church of England purposefully separated the church and the state. I mentioned in a speech that I gave called America is Not a Christian Nation. John Adams said in the Treaty of Tripoli, we're not a Christian nation. Thomas Jefferson went through the Bible with a razor blade, and he sliced out all the supernatural stuff that Jesus did, including his resurrection, in his own version of the Bible, because he didn't buy it. You can go see that Jefferson Bible at the Smithsonian. The founders knew the dangers of a theocracy. We should be a nation that protects religious liberty individually, but we are not a state church.
Yeah, well, and Roger Williams, the Baptist in Rhode Island, was paramount in pushing for not having a state church, and so it wasn't just the progressive or secular founding fathers were fighting against the religious people who wanted a state church or something like that. So you're right. Even the religious people, the Christians that were here, were oftentimes fleeing the persecution they were getting, not from atheists in Europe, but they were fleeing from the state church.
There's an organization, their name escapes me at the moment, but Tony Campolo, the famous evangelist, and others are on it, and they're an actual religious board of an organization of people who say, God doesn't need the whole government to be a church. God doesn't require this to be able to be God. And so even as devout Christians, they understand the dangers of turning the government into a specific religious organization, and they're working to protect that line.
What do they say about bringing the government into the situation? It's like you get the efficiency of the post office coupled with the compassion of the IRS.
There's probably a lot of truth to that.
Yeah. That's good. Do we have one final question before I kind of wrap up and talk about next month again?
I think that's all the questions we have.
We're clear on the questions, and I think Seth is probably done with that too.
Well, forgive any bloviating on my part. I tend to be a little
you did great in the hot seat. I mean, my goodness. Imagine
perfect.
a panel of atheists. It's you did great, Seth, and no sweat on the brow too. Really good.
The truth is that I would love to be able to sit down with you guys and just hang. I mean, not even talking about heavy stuff. You seem like I really do think that, your beliefs matter, but your beliefs don't make you a good person. Your behavior does. And I think there are a lot of beautiful people who run the spectrum, who have some disagreements, theological, philosophical, or whatever, but they're just good people. And I think we need to rediscover each other and rediscover moments to be able to share life together and exist on this same planet together. And so it's an honor to have met and hung out with you guys. And I hope I get a chance to shake all of your hands and hang out in person when COVID and everything's over.
I would love that, Seth.
Yep, the Red River is just a hop, skip, and a jump.
That's true. The book club is kind of awkward to do on Zoom. What we normally do is we meet at 6 for a meal. So we all sit down and every seat's taken, people sitting on the floor. We fill up our whole little office with 25 to 40, about half and half, and atheists and Christians. And then after we share life and enjoy, then we start the book club. And it is something that I certainly look forward to. And I know a lot of our book club looks forward all month to that. I do hope we can start meeting in person again soon, and we'd love to have you down from Tulsa to talk about maybe Deconverted, one of your other books. We would love to hear that. Great job tonight. I want to thank all of our participants. You were kind and gracious, even me for the most part, but asked some tough questions, but fair, and we really appreciate that. I do want to remind you, get ready for our next book club. We're going to still be doing Zoom December 3rd at 7 p.m. Frank Turek will be with us. It was supposed to be in person, but he will be joining us online, and I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. So, Seth, have you ever met Frank?
I've never met him in person. No, I'm familiar with his work, though.
Okay, great. So anyway, thanks so much again, Seth, for being here. You've been an excellent guest for us. Appreciate your time and the effort. Enjoyed reading the book. And thanks so much. And we will see you guys next month.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Thanks, Seth. Thank you.
Follow The Thinking Atheist on Facebook and Twitter for a complete archive of podcasts and videos, products like mugs and t-shirts featuring the Thinking Atheist logo, links to atheist pages and resources, and details on upcoming free thought events and conventions. Log on to our website, thethinkingatheist.com.